This is Hugh White. He's worked at the topmost levels of government in foreign affairs and defence for the last 40 years. He's been the personal advisor to Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. He worked closely with Prime Minister John Howard during the East Timor crisis with Indonesia.
Tensions are once again simmering in the Strait of Taiwan after a visit to Taipei by high-profile US politician Nancy Pelosi triggered an angry display of force by Beijing. Australia's criticism of the military posturing further infuriated China.
So when necessary, when compelled, we are ready to use all necessary means. As to what does it mean by all necessary means, you can use your imagination.
Missile message. China continues its military drills around Taiwan as diplomatic tensions rise. Australia and the US label the exercises destabilizing.
There is no justification for this extreme, disproportionate, and escalatory military response.
If anyone is equipped to tell us how to avoid a nuclear war with China, it is Hugh White.
Well, I've been working in the foreign affairs and defence field here since 1980. Started working in the Office of National Assessments, as it then was. Did that for a few years. Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister back then. We still had a few years of Malcolm to run before, by the time I got here in 1980. And so I came to ANU in 1983, having enjoyed my work at ONA, but I wanted to do a bit more academic work. And so I came here and started to write a PhD on the oil market, which is what I've been working on in ONA. But I was only a year or so into it when Paul Kelly, who was then with the Sydney Morning Herald, offered me a job as a foreign affairs and defence correspondent at the Sydney Morning Herald, and that proved irresistible to an ambitious young guy. So I went to the old Parliament House and worked in the press gallery there for a year or so, writing the round for the Herald, which was a great fun and great privilege. And then Kim Beazley became Defence Minister after the 1984 election, and not long after he became Defence Minister, he asked me to go and work for him. So I ended up working for Kim from 1984 through till 1990. And
so
then
that's 6 years.
6 years.
Sitting inside runnings of
that's right. I was
foreign affairs and defence.
Well, very much defence policy, very much working very closely with Beazley, and he was, of course, a very ambitious and effective reforming defence minister.
Hands-on.
Very hands-on, and he was terrific to work for. Marvellous minister and a great guy. And then Kim moved out of defence, and so I went to work for Bob Hawke as his international relations advisor for 1990 and 1991, so for the last couple of years, and he was Prime Minister. I was working on Bob's staff, and that was a huge privilege. He was a terrific bloke to work for. And
you say international relations?
Yes, I was called Senior Advisor International Relations, but so that covered a whole range of things. But in part, just because of the events of the time, it involved a lot of stuff that was very familiar to me from my defence work, including the first Iraq War after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the whole business about Operation Desert Storm, and the big discussions in Australia about whether or not we should get involved. I was very closely involved with Bob on all of that sort of stuff.
And what was your position at the time about getting involved?
Oh, I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought that this was a war that should be fought, and I thought it was a war that could be fought. It seemed to me that the military situation was favourable to our side. The strategic objectives we've set ourselves, which were very modest, that is simply to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait rather than to try and topple Saddam Hussein or invade Iraq. I thought those were modest and appropriate and achievable military objectives, and I thought the broader strategic imperatives were quite strong, particularly at that very special moment at the end of the Cold War. A lot of hopes that the United Nations would return to the vision of its founders back in the 1940s. And you know, it's worth remembering when America led the coalition in opposing Iraq and Kuwait in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, it had the support of all of the permanent members of the Security Council, it had the support of Russia and China and so on. Very different situation from what we saw, you know, 12 years later. Well, I was going to say 12 years later in 2003-4 for the invasion of Iraq, which was a completely different operation, which I always thought was a bad idea. So I I worked for Hawke, and then when Hawke was thrown out by Keating, I thought I probably had enough of Parliament House by then. I'd been working in Parliament House then for 9-10 years, so I went back into government, and after a short stint back in ONA, I went to Defence. I worked in Defence then right through until 2000, and most of that time I had a job called the Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence, which means that I was the senior person on the whole sort of strategy and intelligence side of Defence. Which was,
that's a pretty big responsibility.
It was a big job. It was a big job, lovely job, great job, most fascinating job I could imagine.
What was happening at the time?
Well, quite a bit of stuff. We were trying to adapt Australia's defence policy to the end of the Cold War, and that had a couple of components. One was, of course, we were trying to adapt to this new world in the 1990s when we were doing lots of peacekeeping and stabilisation operations. We had deployments to Rwanda and Somalia and Cambodia and Bougainville. We had the big intervention in East Timor, of course, in 1999. I was very closely involved in all of that. So there was all of that going on. At the same time, in a different time frame, but still very much present in our mind, we were trying to adapt to what we already recognised back then in the early to mid-90s as a fundamental change in the broader strategic situation in Asia with the rise of China. And so right from the early 90s, I was working quite steadily on what China's rise meant for Australia's position in Asia, what it meant for America's position in Asia, what it meant for the Australia-US alliance and the extent to which we could depend on the United States. So it became it was, often in defence you're working on some short-term stuff with one half of your brain and some very long-term stuff on the other half. And the short-term stuff was Rwanda, Somalia, Cambodia, East Timor. The long-term stuff was, where is all of this stuff with China going? And when I look back and look at the stuff we wrote about the China stuff in the 1994 Defence White Paper, in the 1998 Strategic Policy Review, and in the 2000 Defence White Paper, for which I was the primary author, which was John Howard's big Defence White Paper, I think I'm quite comfortable that we laid a decent foundation for Australia in managing the implications of China's rise for Australia's defence posture, its strategic posture, and so on. I think since then we've, partly because of 9/11 and the way 9/11 distracted everyone, for a decade or so, a really critical decade, but I don't think we've built on that foundation very effectively. But I think the foundations we laid back in the 1990s weren't too bad.
So how do we get back to that sort of building and going forward, or has it gone too far down the path now to potentially near the abyss?
Well, I don't think it's gone too far, but it's certainly gone a long way. And I think what we need to do to build a better future for ourselves in the very different Asia, which seems to me to be emerging at the moment, is first of all to recognise how significant, how seismic China's rise has been, and how unrealistic it is of us to expect, as I think we do expect, that America can remain the dominant power in East Asia, the primary guarantor of Australia's security, the foundation, the sort of, the leader of the strategic order in the region, the way it has been. And it's not that I wouldn't like that to be the case. I'm basically, notwithstanding all the peculiarities of America, particularly at the moment, I'm basically a pretty pro-American kind of a person. I think American leadership has been very good for Australia in the past, by and large. And if America could remain the primary power in East Asia, continue to exercise that kind of unchallenged domination that it really fell into it really since the Vietnam War, then that would be very good for Australia. But the fact is, I think China's rise, I think China's power and its ambition are too great for America to be able to retain that position. And Australia's mistake progressively, and I think that mistake has become more serious and more marked the more time has passed, has been to keep on hanging tighter and tighter to America, becoming more and more dependent on America to solve our China problem for us, to manage China's rise for us, as America has become less and less capable of managing that, primarily because China's power has grown. And so as China's power, started down there and America was up here, America's still very powerful. It's not that America's declined, but China's gone like that and it's going to keep going further, higher. I think we're very unrealistic if we can expect that America can continue to play the same role in keeping Asia stable and the same role in keeping Australia safe in the decades to come as it's played in the decades to past. And in fact, more than that, I think America is now in the position where it's the only way it can try and contain China's ambitions in East Asia is to threaten to go to war. And I think that would be a big mistake, because I don't think that's a war that America can win. And I think that there's a serious chance that the war could break out nonetheless. And that would be a very serious disaster.
Simply because it would be nuclear very quickly.
I think that's right. I mean, at the end of the Cold War, people got stuck on the idea that America was so powerful militarily with its conventional forces that somehow nuclear weapons have become irrelevant, that America would be assured of winning any war against any adversary anywhere just by using its conventional forces. And so the nuclear forces were kind of just in the background. And so, with the end of the Cold War, we all breathed a sigh of relief because the threat of imminent nuclear catastrophe had faded away. What we forgot was the nuclear weapons were still there. And whilst it was true for a while that America's conventional forces were so superior that they could defeat any potential adversary, and therefore it was true for a while that the nuclear weapons, even if they were still there, had become kind of irrelevant to the strategic calculation. That's become less and less true. It's certainly become less and less true in Asia, and particularly become less and less true vis-a-vis China, because China's own capabilities have grown so much. And that's not just that the Chinese have made a lot of money and spent a lot of money on defence. It's also spent it very wisely. They've been very focused directly on the forces they needed to build in order to resist America's attempts to project power by sea into East Asia and the Western Pacific. And so whereas...
So what did they spend it on? The Navy, maybe?
Well, they spent it on air and maritime capabilities, but more than that, they've spent it specifically on the kinds of forces they need to prevent America projecting power by sea against them. So they've spent a bit of money they've built some aircraft carriers, for example, but so that they can project power themselves. But where the really big bucks have gone and the cleverness has gone is in building capabilities like anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, submarines, sea mines, which they can use to prevent America projecting power by sea against China. And that's the key for China, that's the key to winning a war over Taiwan, for example, because America would have to project power by sea right up against China, the Chinese coast, and the Chinese have got lots of ways of preventing the United States doing that, imposing very heavy costs. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese could win a war against America in the sense of, force the Americans to surrender. What it means is that after a few weeks of a war, and it was worth bearing in mind, it would be the biggest war probably since World War II. Not since World War II, it's worth remembering, have two major powers gone to war with one another. We've had major powers going to war with smaller powers. We haven't had major powers against major powers, at least other than some very small border skirmishes. There was a border skirmish between China and Russia in 1968, for example, but a US-China conflict over Taiwan would not be a border skirmish. It would be a full-scale war. And it would, I think, almost certainly be the biggest war, as I say, since 1945. But after a few weeks of that, what we'd end up with would be that the Chinese would have sunk a lot of American ships and shot down a lot of American aircraft. The Americans would have shot down a lot of Chinese aircraft and attacked a lot of Chinese bases on the Chinese mainland. Both sides would have taken a lot of damage. Neither side would have got themselves in anything that looked like a winning position. And they both then ask themselves, well, what can we do to break this stalemate? And the danger is that both sides have no options other than to look for their nuclear forces. Now, the Americans, I don't think, would aim to use their nuclear weapons. What they try to do is to say to the Chinese, you stop and back off, or we'll use nuclear weapons. So they try to use the threat rather than the weapons themselves. My reservation about that is that I don't think that threat would work, because I don't think the Chinese would believe the Americans would be willing to use nuclear weapons, because the Chinese have got the capacity to retaliate against the United States with their own nuclear forces if America attacks China with nuclear forces. And so I think China's deterrent capability, retaliatory capability, would deter the United States from using their nuclear weapons, and that means their threat of nuclear weapons wouldn't succeed. And for that reason, I think the US is in the position that it's easy to start a war with China over Taiwan, but very hard for Americans to work out how they can win it. And once you start making nuclear threats, the risk that it goes off the rails, even if you don't intend to use your nuclear weapons to start with, the risk that the Chinese try to preempt or that the Americans lose their nerve. We learnt during the Cold War how difficult the management of these nuclear crises is, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, no one could be sure that the US and China going into that kind of crisis would find a way to avoid crossing the nuclear threshold. And in fact, I think the temptation from both sides to end up crossing the nuclear threshold would be quite high, even though it would clearly be catastrophic for both of them. And people might look at that and say, how could that possibly happen? Well, what we learned in the Cold War is that, the serious leaders of very serious countries nonetheless can contemplate these things.
And we're seeing right now with the Ukraine,
Exactly.
Putin's bogged down there.
Yeah.
He sort of thought it was going to be pretty quick and so on. But
No, look, I think that's exactly right. The Ukraine has amplified these anxieties a lot. First of all, because it's reminded people that real serious wars can happen. That, I think a lot of people looking at Putin, indeed Zelensky himself in the lead-up, was saying, don't worry about Russia's build-up, they're not really serious about this.
Rattling sabres.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they weren't just rattling the sabres, they were drawing the sabres. And I think, the people sometimes talk about the Thucydides trap, that, when two great powers are competing over their place in the international system, war is inevitable. Well, I don't think war is inevitable, but I think it's certainly true that war becomes a very real danger. And just how real that danger is has been illustrated by the Ukraine, because in the end, I think a lot of people optimistically believe that NATO and the United States could deter Russia from trying it on. But the fact is that Russia wasn't deterred. And I think, likewise, I think people overestimate the West's capacity to deter China from moving militarily against Taiwan when the stakes for China are very high. And I think there's a very real danger that the Chinese will conclude that just as in Ukraine, the US wasn't prepared to fight because, as Joe Biden said, he didn't want to fight World War III. Well, a war with China over Taiwan would be World War III, and I think there's a real danger that, despite what Biden sometimes says, that the Chinese believe the Americans wouldn't be prepared to fight, precisely because there's no obvious way for the United States to win such a war, and a real danger of it going nuclear. So I think there's a danger that guys in Beijing think the Americans aren't going to fight a war they can't win. If we attack Taiwan, they'll make a noise, they'll put on sanctions, they'll criticise us, but they won't in the end do anything militarily.
Simply because the cost to America was too great.
Exactly. The cost to America is too great, and the imperatives are just not there. It's not as important to America as it was, for example, in the heyday of the Cold War. And so for that reason, I think the reason that the harder it is for the Chinese to believe that America would really fight, the more likely it is the Chinese will have a go. And the danger we face then is twofold. The first is that America won't fight. And if it doesn't fight, I think that has a huge implications for America's strategic position in East Asia. I think it undermines the credibility of America's guarantees to its other allies in East Asia, to Japan, to South Korea, to Australia, and its credibility to its friends, the countries of Southeast Asia in particular, who America kind of depends on to sustain their position. And so I think it would have a very significant damage. In fact, I think particularly in Japan, it would be very hard for Japan to continue to depend on the United States to defend them from China if America had not been willing to defend Taiwan. And so that means that the credibility of America's position in East Asia is very seriously affected. And I think it could really mark the end of America's position as a significant strategic player in Asia. It's the classic power transition whereby a rising power, tries to assert itself. The old established power tries to defend its position, and and the old established power can't quite believe that things have changed. So, we saw it with the decline of the British Empire, of course. The British kept on hanging on until an event happened like the Suez Crisis in 1956, which just shows everyone that Britain wasn't the power that it used to be. And I think a Taiwan crisis, if the Americans don't choose not to defend Taiwan, after all the talk they've given and all the sort of bravado, I think that would be America's Suez moment, if you know what I mean. The moment where it became clear that the long-term trends in the decades before had brought them to the point where they no longer could credibly exercise the kind of strategic role they claim for themselves. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that America makes the other decision, that Joe Biden at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever time the call comes through, instead of saying, I'm not going to fight a war that I can't win and that might go nuclear, he makes the other decision and decides he will fight. Now then, we're in even worse trouble because he's not going to win that war.
Yeah.
There's a very real chance that it goes nuclear. Whatever happens, America's strategic position in East Asia is destroyed. But on the first option, it's destroyed without a war, which is very serious but kind of manageable. Second one, it's just a disaster. And the problem for Australia's position is that we're on the side that's urging the United States to go to war. I mean, I don't think Australians register quite clearly enough that a lot of the talk we've seen particularly from the previous government, the new government, the Albanese government is early days yet. It's a little bit less clear, but the previous government, the Morrison government, and particularly Peter Dutton as Defence Minister, were making it very clear that they believed that Australia should be willing to go to war to support the United States, and that they believed the United States should be willing to go to war to defend Taiwan. And
that's such a crazy notion.
Well, I just think that I don't know whether Dutton really had thought about it very seriously. You see, it's one thing for an Australian political leader to say that we should support the United States in invading Iraq. Now, that was a disaster, as we know, and it was a terrible disaster for the Iraqi people and a terrible disaster for the United States. It didn't, in the end, it cost Australia $1 billion and a couple of lives, but it wasn't in a sense we could sort of, okay, that was a mistake, we could move on. And I think maybe Peter Dutton thinks that talking about talk about defending Taiwan is like talking about invading Iraq. It's a kind of a thing, a posture that you adopt.
The Defence Minister has issued a startling warning to Australians to prepare for war. He's likened the aggression of Russia and China to Hitler's Germany ahead of World War II. Anzac Day is usually a time for political campaigning to pause, but Peter Dutton has fuelled the debate on who's better placed to protect Australia.
The only way that you can preserve peace is to prepare for war.
Provocative, most definitely, but according to the Defence Minister,
That's the sobering reality of where we are.
This is the classic situation where you have a rising power meeting an established power. We know how dangerous it is from World War I, where you had the rising power of Germany, and for that matter the rising power of Russia, and America for that matter, and you had the declining power of Britain and France and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and all of these countries found themselves challenging one another for their place in the international system. And countries like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and for that matter the Russian Empire, went to war to try and consolidate their position and ended up destroying themselves. The German Empire was destroyed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was destroyed, the Russian Empire was destroyed, the Turkish Empire was destroyed. And so all of these countries had gone to war hoping to improve their position and ended up destroying themselves. Now, I think there's a kind of a risk that America faces the same kind of danger at the moment. It's trying to preserve its position as the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And it seems to think that by going to war with China, it can preserve that position. But in fact, because that's a war it can't win, and it's a war that could easily go nuclear, it'll end up destroying its place in East Asia and quite possibly destroying its global role if it starts a war that it can't win, and particularly if it starts a war that goes nuclear. And I think America will always remain the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. But the idea of America as the dominant power in East Asia, as the dominant power globally, as the leading power in the Middle East and Europe, I don't think that would survive. None of that would survive the loss of a war with China over Taiwan. You know, Australia's have always been fixated on the idea that our security absolutely depended on Asia continuing to be dominated by an Anglo-Saxon power, either Britain or America. And one of the strange things about our history is that that's always been true. Ever since 1788, Britain was the dominant power all through the 19th century and into the 20th century, and then as Britain faded, America took its place. You know, Curtin turning to America in 1941 and so on. Now, my argument is that right now we're at the point where Australia can no longer depend on America to preserve its position in Asia. And we therefore have to start thinking about how we're going to make our way in Asia, which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by an Anglo-Saxon great and powerful friend, in Menzies' phrase. And that requires us to do a couple of things. The first is to stop encouraging the Americans to confront China in a strategic contest that I don't think it's going to win. And the second is to start thinking, well, what kind of things should Australia do to prepare itself to make its way in Asia, which is no longer dominated for us in this way. Now, that's actually something that Australians used to think quite a lot about. If you go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s, we spent quite a lot of time in Australia thinking about our eventual strategic future in Asia, which, and here's a phrase that Bob Hawke and Paul Keating used, where we'd look for our security not from Asia, but in Asia. And I think that's an idea we have to get back to. And I think that means we have to, think about how we'd work with China, how we'd find a way to manage our relations with China when we no longer have America to shield us from China. Now, that's going to require some uncomfortable compromises. It's going to be difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. We also have to start thinking much more carefully about how we work with other countries in the region. Now, a lot of Australian political leaders talk about working with countries in the region, but if you look at what we've done over the last few years, increasingly, our diplomacy in Asia with countries like the countries of Southeast Asia or Japan or South Korea or India for that matter, have been to talk to them about how important it is for everyone to support America to remain the dominant power in East Asia. Now, if that's not going to work, then making that the focus of our regional diplomacy is a dead end. What we need to do is to go to these countries and say, okay, we're all going to be living in a region in which China is at the very least going to be playing a more dominant role than it used to play. So we have to start thinking much more carefully about how we manage China, how we do it individually, and how we can do it cooperatively. That's not in the sense of building a sort of an Asian confrontation containment alliance like NATO against China. It's a matter of just learning to live with the new facts of power. And I think so that would be a very different kind of regional diplomacy. The other thing I think we have to do is to start rethinking what's happening with India. Because India is a very big part of this picture. There's not just one rising great Asian power, there's two. India's a couple of decades behind China. It's taking a different path, and it's probably going to be a more winding path. It's not just going to grow straight the way China's grown, but it's going to get there. It's going to have a bigger population than China's. It's going to have the second biggest economy in the world. It's going to have a very formidable military, and it's going to have real strategic ambitions. It's going to end up, I think, being a great power, an ambitious great power, very much the way China is. And so we need to stop thinking of India simply as a country that we hope will counterbalance China and help us solve our China problem, and think of it as a great power in its own right. And we're going to have to manage our relations with India much as we manage our relations with China. That's bad news in some ways. It means we've got two potentially intrusive great powers to deal with, but it's also good news because it means we're going to have two great powers we can sort of play off against one another. I call this the sort of Mongolian model of foreign policy. Mongolia sits there between Russia and China, and its whole foreign policy is about playing those two guys off against one another. And I think that's going to be a little bit like Australia's position between India and China. They're both going to be establishing their spheres of influence. I think China is going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers East Asia and the Western Pacific. India's going to want to have a sphere of influence that covers South Asia and the Indian Ocean. We happen to sit on the boundaries between those two spheres of influence, and that means we're going to be pushed from both sides, which is bad, but it also means we can play both sides off against one another. So we can use the Indians to deflect the Chinese and the Chinese to deflect the Indians. That's going to be very difficult diplomacy very different from the kind of diplomacy we've done in the past, but it's not impossible.
Do you think Penny Wong's up to it?
I've got a lot of time for Penny Wong, but I don't think she's yet had the courage to address, and perhaps even to admit to herself, the seriousness of the situation. She keeps talking about America as the most important of our relationships. She talked during the election campaign of America as the indispensable power. And that's 1990s talk. America is not indispensable, at least it better not be indispensable, because I think we're going to have to do without it. I think we need Penny Wong, and for that matter, Anthony Albanese
and Richard Marles
to come out and say, of course America's going to be important, it's a close friend, we shouldn't abandon America, but we should be very realistic that we're not going to be able to live in an Asia in which America is the most important power. We're going to be living in an age in which China is the most important power on that side, and India is the most important power on this side, and managing those two relationships is key, and America can't be expected to do very much to help us with either of them. It's perfectly possible, in fact I think it's the most likely outcome, is that within a decade or two, which is very soon in these sorts of issues, America will cease to play any significant strategic role in Asia at all, and that means that we really will be, for the first time in our history, first time since 1788 I mean, on our own. And I don't think Penny Wong or Anthony Albanese has yet been prepared to face up to that, and have yet been prepared to explain that to Australians. And the first task of any Australian government in addressing what is, you know, in many ways, the most fundamental shift in our strategic environment since European settlement, because it's the first time since European settlement that neither Britain nor America has been the dominant power in East Asia. The most important thing we have to do is to acknowledge that to ourselves and to have a conversation with ourselves about what that means, about how we redefine ourselves as an Asian, as a member of an Asian strategic order which is dominated by Asian countries. And you know, you go back to Whitlam or Fraser or Hawke or Keating, or for that matter, you know, not so much Menzies himself, but his foreign ministers like Casey and Haslick, Spender. These guys were very strongly committed to Australia progressively accommodating itself to an Asia which was no longer dominated by outside powers. And if you think of, you know, all the debates in Australia in the 1960s about Vietnam, what lay behind so much of the passion in that debate was a Labor vision of Australia's future in which we would cease to rely on the United States to shield us from Asia, and we'd start trying to work with Asia on our own terms.
So we've really gone backwards, haven't we?
We have gone backwards. That's exactly right. I think, and I think the historians will judge that we started going backwards in 1996. That
as a result of
the result of John Howard becoming Prime Minister. I think he was trying to react.
The white picket fence of Australia of the 50s.
Exactly, and an Australia which is relaxed and comfortable, and as an Australia which, in Howard's famous phrase, doesn't have to choose between its history and its geography. And when Howard said that, what he really meant was, we can ignore our geography. That's what he really meant by that. That we don't have to accommodate ourselves to Asia, that Asia can take us as we are, and will have to take us as we are. And I think there's an interesting piece of timing, because that partly reflected, obviously, Howard's own very deep persona. But it also reflected the moment, because this was the moment in history. By the time you get to 95, 96, that's the point where America really started feeling its post-Cold War power. In those first couple of decades, the first couple of years in the 1990s, America was still very unsure about whether it was going to withdraw, sort of return to isolationism after the end of the Cold War. But by the time we get to 96, just at the time that Howard's taking power, you've got America coming out of itself, seeing itself as the new Rome, you know, the hyperpower, as a famous Frenchman called it. And so I think Howard's own instincts gelled with the moment where it seemed that America was going to dominate the world for as far ahead as anyone can see. You know, this is the time when people thought that America was going to be unchallengeably preeminent on every dimension of national power for as far ahead as anyone could see. And so he felt that we could just cling to America and cling to America harder than we'd ever done before, harder than we had during the 50s and 60s. And that would be fine because America would be unchallenged. Well, it transpires that America is not unchallenged. Indeed, these days, today, it faces in China a more formidable rival than it's ever faced before. It is more formidable than Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, and it's more formidable even than the Soviet Union. It hasn't got as many nuclear weapons as the Soviet Union had, hasn't got as many divisions as the Soviet Union had, but it's got a bigger economy and it's got better technology, and that makes it fundamentally a much more formidable adversary.
Does China really want to invade us and take over Australia?
Look, I don't think so. I think what China wants is to be the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. It wants to dominate its region, very much the way America dominates the Western Hemisphere. But in order to do that, it doesn't have to invade. It's going to throw its weight around. We're going to have to get used to that, just as America throws its weight around in the Western Hemisphere. But I think the idea that, or for that matter, just as we throw our weight around in the South Pacific, where we claim a sphere of influence. But I don't think China needs to invade us. I don't think we should be complacent about this. China will be an assertive power. It will seek to get its way where it believes its interests are engaged. But I don't think it makes sense for us to fear that China wants to fundamentally transform our way of life, to fundamentally suborn our political system, to threaten our democratic processes and so on, because I don't think in the end that matters very much to China. What matters to China is that nothing happens in Australia that threatens the position of the Chinese Communist Party in China. They'll be very attentive to that. They'll be concerned to make sure that nothing that Australia does undermines China's position as the leading country in East Asia, and they'll be very concerned to make sure that nothing we do really damages China's economic prospects. And so there's a real, sort of framework of influence, and I think at times probably interference that the Chinese are likely to run. But I think the question for us is, can we manage that? Can we survive it?
I think
can we work around it? I think we can. I think we underestimate ourselves if we believe that we can't manage our place in Asia as a middle power in the face of a great power. After all, that's what middle powers around the world have to do all the time. We're unusual in that we've always had these great and powerful friends to protect us. But most middle powers, most of the time, you think of the Dutch and the Belgians, or the Portuguese in Europe, you think of the Vietnamese and the Indonesians and the South Koreans in Asia. That's what middle powers have to do, and it's not easy. You've got to be a bit agile. You've got to be a bit flexible. Sometimes you have to bend and give away things you don't want to give away, but that's what goes with the territory. If we don't like that, we should go home to Britain. We really want to do that.
That's great, Hugh. Yeah. What do you think ordinary Australians can do in the face of this, rather than just relying upon our politicians and hope that they get it right, hope that Penny Wong grows into the job very quickly and works out what she's got to do to be a true Manchurian candidate?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's obviously two dimensions to this. The first is, I think it does make huge demands on political leadership. This is a very significant change in Australia's circumstances, and one of the great tests of political leadership is the capacity to explain to the community, to explain to the electorate what's changing and how do we have to respond to it. And we could see Hawke and Keating doing this on the economic front, for example, in the 80s and 90s. We could see the way in which Curtin and Chifley, and yes, Menzies and Spender and Casey doing this with the strategic transformations of the wartime and the post-war era. This was real strategic leadership at work. And I think we have seen a deficit in strategic political leadership in Australia in recent decades, not just on the strategic side, I think also on the economic side and the social side as well. But we do face this very significant strategic challenge. And so I think, the first thing we need to do is to turn to our political leaders. But of course, in the end, they're our leaders. We elected them. We get the leadership we deserve. That's what democracy means. And so I think there is a challenge for Australians here. And I think one of the challenges we do need, if I can put it this way, to educate ourselves a bit. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, the Australian electorate didn't pay much attention to economics. After budget night, they had beer, cigs up, the sort of standard headline. And that was economic policy. But by the time you got into the 1980s and 1990s, the Australian electorate, ordinary Australians, really started to understand a bit about economics. They understood about exchange rates. They understood about floating the dollar. They understood about the importance of dismantling protectionism, so we weren't protecting uneconomic industries. And so very unpopular things that people really didn't want to have happen, nonetheless political leaders could sell them. And, I think it's pretty broadly accepted. Although there was a lot of pain and, of course, a lot of debate, Australia's economic good fortune in the last few decades has been based on the political decisions that were made with the active support of Australian voters in the 80s and 90s. We need to do the same thing in strategic affairs. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the Australian voters knew a fair bit about strategic and defence policy because they'd all lived through the Second World War. And their parents had lived through the First World War. They had a deep sort of instincts about these questions. But I think we now have a generation of political leaders and a generation of voters who really don't know much about this stuff and haven't thought about it very much. And it's not just that they don't think about it at all, it's when they do think about it, they think about it in very romanticised terms. I also think there was a greater tendency to romanticise war, to romanticise military service, to feel kind of proud that Australia was out there fighting. And I think, although there's understandable elements in all of that, I think in the end we need to be much more serious about war to really understand what's at stake. And so I think it's become very easy for our political leaders to slide past a really serious
public debate, trying to avoid a serious public debate on this stuff, and to just resort to slogans, we'll trust us, we'll take care of it, and
exactly.
You get on with feeding the kids and getting them out to school on time,
exactly,
and the super.
But also that, we'll stand by our values. Our political leaders say, Australia will always stand up for its interests. Well, as if it's that easy, as if we don't have interests on both sides. Of course we have interests in defending Australian trade, for example, but we also have interests in not going to war with a nuclear-armed great power. There are interests on both sides. It's not if government was so easy that all you had to do was to say, all our interests are over there, we'll do whatever is required to defend them, government would be a very easy business. What's difficult is that we have to balance very complex interests in standing up for ourselves in relation to China, but also managing a relationship with China which can be made to work, and not pretending to everyone that we can get around this problem by clinging to the United States, and especially by encouraging the United States to go to war with China that it can't defeat. So I think we need to, that it is in the end up to us to demand more of our leaders, and our leaders should be leading us, but we as a community have a much bigger responsibility, I think. And I think that's because Australians have been lucky. We have had very peaceful, very secure few decades, and I think we need to get over that. We need just to understand what's going on
and ask the hard questions.
And ask the hard questions of our leaders. So it's one of those iterative things. We need to be better led by our leaders, but we need to lead our leaders better ourselves.
Right.
As is the AUKUS deal. It's designed to counter China, but Indonesia doesn't like the idea of nuclear-powered submarines patrolling its neighbourhood.
Nuclear subs.
Yep.
Why are they a stupid idea to invest so much money for subs that won't be available till 2050?
I think submarines are very important to Australia, but I think the idea of buying nuclear submarines is really dumb, and it's really dumb for 4 different reasons. The first is the idea of buying nuclear subs is very much tied up with the idea that the primary purpose of the Australian military is to support the United States in a war with China. And I don't think that's the right way to think of Australia's defence. The most important thing for us is to build the capacity to defend ourselves independently of the United States in an era in which the United States is no longer playing a significant role in Asia. The second reason is that nuclear subs cost a lot more than conventional subs. A credible estimate, we could buy 25 really good conventionally powered submarines for the price we'll pay, we hope to pay, for 8 nuclear powered submarines. We get 3 times as many submarines, and numbers really matter. You know, the more boats you have out there, the more of the other guy's ships you're going to sink, the more damage you'll do to him. So the fact that nuclear submarines are so expensive and therefore drive down the numbers we can afford is a really big issue.
When would those 25 subs be delivered?
I'm going to say that the third reason I don't like nuclear subs, is that it's going to take so long to deliver them. Now, the government often says the first boat will be delivered sometime around 2040, but the first boat doesn't matter, because one boat isn't a capability. We need, and we know this, we need 6 boats. 6 boats is the absolute minimum viable operational capability. And on the very most optimistic estimates, we won't have 6 boats until the middle of the 2050s. Now, the fact is that the strategic contest over the future of Asia will be long over by then. And we're in very grave danger of facing the most dangerous decades we've seen since the 1940s without any submarine capability at all. And the fourth reason is that we have no reason to believe we can actually operate these boats. I mean, this is a nuclear-powered submarine has a nuclear reactor in it. Australia has almost no experience of operating nuclear reactors, no experience at all of operating them in this kind of setting. And the demands on the Royal Australian Navy to try and get these things to work, well, put it this way, the risk that we don't get it right, the risk that we can't operate them effectively, and therefore that even the boats we have won't be able to get to sea, won't be able to fight effectively, is very high. So I think it's a classic example that the Navy, the government, is going for something sort of
bells and whistles.
Exactly, glitzy and glamorous and sounds great. But in terms of practically delivering real military capability, it makes no sense at all.
Reports FBI agents were looking for classified documents on nuclear weapons during the raid on Donald Trump's home.
But I don't think it's just luck that's seen us survive the nuclear age so far. Because there was the particular characteristics about the Cold War which improved our chances of avoiding Armageddon. And in particular, it was because the two sides were roughly equal and acknowledged one another as equals. There were 2 superpowers and they both saw one another as equals and acknowledged one another as equals. And the other thing was they both were very convinced that the other side would do whatever it took to avoid being subordinate to the other. And so nobody on either side, nobody in Washington doubted Moscow's resolve. Nobody in Moscow doubted Washington's resolve. So, for example, that border down the middle of Europe, the Iron Curtain down the middle of Europe, everybody knew in Moscow that if they drove their tanks into West Berlin, the Americans would fight with nuclear weapons. And likewise, everyone in Washington knew that if they drove their tanks across into East Berlin, the guys in Moscow would fight with nuclear weapons. And so neither side was in any doubt about the other side's resolve. And the scariest moments of the Cold War, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, were precisely those moments where one side or the other made a temporary miscalculation about the other's resolve. Khrushchev thought he could put nuclear weapons into Cuba and Kennedy wouldn't fight. And Kennedy persuaded him that he would. And that actually kept that balance, which seemed so precarious at the time, kept it relatively stable. What makes the present moment more dangerous is that the balance of resolve is much less clear. It's much less clear, for example, that the United States is willing to go to war to stop Moscow in Ukraine, in fact we know they're not, or to stop Moscow in invading Poland. Now, you know, they say, Biden says we'll defend our NATO allies, but when push comes to shove, the imperatives for America to defend Poland today are nothing like as strong as the imperatives for America to defend West Germany back during the Cold War. And the same is true in Asia. What makes the situation in Asia so dangerous is the likelihood that the Chinese don't believe the Americans would fight. And the reason they don't believe the Americans would fight is because they know that the imperatives for America to do so, the really fundamental US national interests at stake in sustaining Taiwan, are nothing like as powerful as the imperatives that drove them during the Cold War. And so the stability of that bipolar order that was what characterised the Cold War was in fact in many ways more secure than the much more complex multipolar order we sit in today, where the motives of the United States in particular are much less clear than they were, and therefore it's much more likely that either Moscow or Beijing will test them. And once that test's underway, that presents an American president with a very stark choice. He or she either backs off or pushes forward and loses face. I mean, more than face, loses America's whole position as a global power, or they don't back off, they push forward and lurches into a nuclear war. This would anyway be an extraordinarily difficult issue for America to address, and that's not particularly unique to America. All great powers find it difficult to step back from a pinnacle of power. The British found it difficult, and so on. So we shouldn't be surprised by that America finds this difficult, but it's made all the harder by the fact that America itself is going through this really, I think, potentially catastrophic domestic political upheaval at the same time. I think Australians do underestimate just how serious the challenge to America's political stability by Trump, by the Republicans, by the undermining of the credibility of the American electoral system has been. And the fact is that on the Democrat side as well, you do have what appears to be a significant failure of leadership. I mean, it is extraordinary that Joe Biden, though a likeable character, I guess, was the best that the Democratic side of America, that half of America could throw up to take on Donald Trump. It's astonishing that after Trump's performance as president, he still ended up with more votes than he got in 2016. And no one can be sure that he won't run in 2024. No one can be sure that he won't win if he runs, and even if he doesn't run or doesn't win, the other candidate who's likely to be there, the other people who will find their way through the Republican primary process, are likely to be perhaps just as bad and less incompetent. So I do think, even without that, America's challenge would be very serious, and Australia's challenge in adapting to America's challenge in East Asia would be very serious. But when we add to that the dysfunction in the US political system, I think that simply has to reinforce our uncertainties. And it's worth remembering that although the people in Washington DC and the foreign and strategic policy communities talk a lot about the importance of confronting China in this new Cold War, out there in the real America, out there where the votes are won and lost, I think the support for real tough action against China is very weak. And it's worth remembering that Donald Trump wasn't the only one who campaigned on isolationism. Donald Trump had his, America First slogan, but Joe Biden campaigned on a thing called foreign policy for the middle class, by which he meant, and he spelled this out, that everything that his administration would do in foreign policy would be designed to support the interests of ordinary American families. Well, going to war with China over Taiwan doesn't support the interests of ordinary American families.
So given the upheaval within the United States political system, isn't it more important that our government, our leaders, Penny Wong and Albo and Miles and co, forge our own independent policy foreign-wise to be able to stand on our own 2 feet?
Oh yes, I think it is. I think it's very important that our political leaders stop pretending to themselves and stop pretending to the Australian electorate that everything in Washington is fine, and stop pretending that Washington has the answer to our China problem. The fact is we're going to have to find our own answers to the China problem, and it's going to be a very complex thing. It's, in some ways, I think it's one of the biggest challenges that Australia has ever faced as a country.
What we are calling for right now is a de-escalation of tension. That's what we need to see. It's obviously where Australia's national interest lies, but it's, to be frank, where the global interest lies.
Trying to build a place for Australia, a stable, secure place, respected place for Australia in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by our Anglo-Saxon mates, that is a huge national task. And it's one that we've hardly begun to address.
But it's also exciting if you look at it in that way, Hugh.
No, that is exactly right. That it's
we can at last stand on our own 2 feet in Asia
yes.
and find our own level as a middle power.
That's exactly right. And, this was an idea, there was a sense of excitement about this, which you could see in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And it's that which has drained away. And I think we are actually a less confident country, a less self-aware country, a more dependent country than we have been and than we need to be in future. So I don't think we need to be too scared about this. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the way in which policy has been so strongly framed around clinging to the United States is it seems to me it's so pessimistic about Australia's own potential. I just don't think it's that hard.
Mr Albanese saying the visit is more than symbolic.
A grand entrance to honour a new Prime Minister. Anthony Albanese given a ceremonial welcome by Indonesia's President Joko Widodo at Bogor Palace, capped off with a gesture of friendship.
Saya bergembira bahwa Indonesia.
I am happy that Indonesia is the first visit, 2 weeks after you were sworn in as the 31st Prime Minister. It shows the good relations between the two nations.
As the leaders attempt to give new life to an enduring relationship, the simplicity of bike riding meant to recognise both leaders' humble beginnings.
And our relationship is ever deepened by the strategic and economic interests that we share.
Mr Albanese touched down in Jakarta overnight, greeted by soldiers from the President's personal security force.
Well, it's wonderful to be here in Jakarta.
His new government focused on shoring up support in the Indo-Pacific. Regional security and aid efforts in Southeast Asia also pressing concerns for the two leaders to address, alongside China's attempts to expand its influence in the region.
Our work together continues to grow in scale and in sophistication. Until we meet again, Sampai Katumi Lagi.
We do have, in our present generations and recent generations of political leaders, people who don't actually have much faith in themselves. They don't. When you look at the fragility of Australian political leadership going back to 2007, I think we've got a group of political leaders, and I don't just mean the Prime Ministers, who have been reluctant to take on the scale of the responsibility. And it is a big responsibility, making this new identity for Australia, a new way of conducting ourselves as an international player. It's a big task. It's a very intimidating task. But I think earlier generations of political leaders would have reached out for that task because they had a bit of confidence in themselves. I think we've had some bad luck with our leaders, and I think that's infected our national confidence. It just doesn't feel to me like Australia is as confident a country as we were in earlier decades, and I think we need to kind of rebuild that. And I think if we could do that, I think we can overcome that deeper historical question. I don't despair of our capacity to make our way.